I'm Jonathan Lear. As I think many of you know, I'm the new director of the Neubauer Collegium, and it's a delight to introduce our speaker today, Lawrence Lessig. Now, in his recent book, Republic Lost, Professor Lessig had the civility and the hopefulness to put a comma between Republic and Lost. And I actually just happened to see a T-shirt that had 3 lines. The first line was, "Let's eat, Grandma." The next line said, "Let's eat, Grandma." And the third line said, "Commas save lives." Now, Professor Lessig's point, as I understand it, is not that the Republic has lost, but that it is lost. And you may or may not agree with his vision, but it is incontestable that he has a vision, and he is pursuing it with a rare moral passion and intellectual articulateness. And at the heart of Professor Lessig's academic and political work is a practical attempt to help citizens refine themselves as citizens. Only then, he thinks, can the Republic reanimate itself. And one of the central themes of this book is that outsized campaign contributions not only buy undue influence, they also, in an ironic way, purchase, and put that in quotes, apathy among voters who ought to be active citizens, but due to a lack of trust in government are not. And Professor Lessig is nothing if not ambitious. His aim is to reverse this debilitating trend. Now, the title of Professor Lessig's book, of course, harkens back to Plato's classic, and I doubt there is anywhere in the world that has a higher density population of those whom have read, reread, and discussed that wonderful book than the University of Chicago. But I have long thought that we've been living with the wrong title. The Greek is politeia. There is no definite article. There's no the there. And the translation I prefer of politeia is not republic, but constitution. The translation not only fits the Greek, I think it fits the inquiry. For Plato is concerned with the very idea of constitutionality, not only what constitutes a republic, but what constitutes a well-functioning human soul. And he sees that the two are interrelated, that we flourish as individual human beings in a society that nurtures us and expresses our highest ideals. And when threatened, our very own constitutions, that is, our constitutions as individuals, that too is threatened. We tend to fall apart. Now, that thought, I think, lies at the heart of Lessig's work as I read him. It's right there in this urgency that runs throughout the book that good people can do bad things. And I think it lends his work a sense of urgency. Now, that said, I suspect Plato would be horrified by the direction in which Lessig wants to take us. Plato would see us as, I think, living in what he called a mixed constitution, a democracy that has very pronounced oligarchical features. But the idea that the solution to the problem is to move in the direction of more democracy would appear to Plato, I think, as a disastrous mistake. Still, I mean, I've been imagining in this week of waiting for the lecture, I've been imagining Plato and Lessig squaring off. And I'd like to think that Professor Lessig's meticulous attention to detail, combined with his rigorous hopefulness for democracy, might just provoke Plato to a second thought. Now, Professor Lessig's theme in these lectures is institutional corruption, and today he's going to talk about finance. And as Aristotle made clear, the very idea of corruption is a teleological notion. It depends upon an ideal or purpose, a form or function from which the corruption is a falling away. But is the institution of finance to be understood in this way? As all of you who attended the last lecture will know, we are in for a thought-provoking, passionate, and original interpretation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lawrence Lessig, the inaugural Berlin Family Lecturer in the Humanities, who will today speak on institutional corruption in finance.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's wonderful to be back the second week. David said that I had disproven my Elizabeth Anscombe story, but I do think you're about half as many people as were here last time. But it's wonderful to see so many people here for this lecture, and especially wonderful to reconnect with Jonathan, who I think we met exactly 30 years ago this year while we were at Cambridge. So let me introduce this subject a little bit indirectly. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this incredible book published this year by Henry Holt, by Dr. Martin Blaser, Missing Microbes. So you should think about this book as a kind of silent spring for the gut. It's the story of the microbiome in our bodies, which is a story that at least I was completely unfamiliar with, because it turns out that 70 to 90% of the cells in your body are alien. Of the 70 to 90% of those cells constituting 2 million genes, just about 23,000 of those genes are ours. 99% of the genes are foreign. And these genes and these creatures, let's think of them as, create an ecology that has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, constituting mainly, we could say, good bugs, also some bad bugs, and also some bad bugs that do a lot of good. Sorry, that's a cheap shot for Lyndon Johnson. So in that context, what's striking about the 20th century is we invented a new technology, the technology of antibiotics, which are by design, like in the philosophical metaphor, which has a particular salience here, like dropping a bomb on Chicago for the purpose of, dropping a bomb on Chicago for the purpose of getting Al Capone. And it's not just a single bomb that we drop within our microbiome. Of course, through our life, we drop many, many bombs, wiping out whole sections of this ecology. And what's striking is that the most common bomb we drop is dropped for the purpose of facilitating the fattening of these creatures. 70 to 80% of the antibiotics that we consume as the byproduct from fattening animals for farming. Now, as we do this, as we consume in this way, we develop a resistance to the effects of these antibiotics. The number of creatures that are no longer susceptible to these antibiotics grows. In 2013, Consumer Union tested hog carcasses and found 13 of 14 Staphylococcus samples isolated from this pork were resistant to at least one antibiotic, 6 of 8 Salmonella samplings, 121 of 132 Yersinia samples. So this incredible growth of bugs that can't be dealt with by antibiotics anymore, but more importantly is a certain kind of annihilation of parts of this ecology. And as Blaser describes it, a rise in plagues as the byproduct of this annihilation. As Dr. Abigail Zuger put it in a review of the book in the New York Times, the war against the old plagues is simply leading to worse wars against a whole series of new ones. And this is especially dramatic in the context of children. As the book characterizes it, disturbing the microbes of mice during a critical early window is sufficient to change the course of their development. Later section discussing the relationship between these fattening antibiotics and children. Blaser produces research to demonstrate children who received antibiotics in the first 6 months of life became fatter later on. Diseases such as juvenile diabetes, celiac disease, asthma, and even the suggestion in research now that possibly autism might be tied, all possibly tied to the early antibiotic exposure that our children and we experience. Okay, so Blazer's book is an environmentalism for the gut, an environmentalism for the body, an environmentalism for human life. Let me translate it a little bit into Chicago terms. What he's talking about is a certain kind of externality that we don't yet have a system to account for. Okay. Now, my topic in these lectures is institutional corruption, which, as I described last week, I mean to be an influence within an economy of influence that weakens the effectiveness of an institution, especially by weakening public trust of that institution. And my lecture today is not to be about healthcare. My lecture today is about finance. But in talking about finance, I think this description will illuminate as much about institutional corruption as it's meant to illuminate about finance. I want to use finance to help set some framework around the idea of institutional corruption that I intend to develop over the course of these lectures. And the first critical point is to recognize the way in which institutional corruption is institution relative. It depends upon the particular institution. So if we're talking about an influence within an economy of influence that weakens the effectiveness of an institution, that means we need to ask effective relative to what? What is the baseline? As Jonathan was describing of Plato's understanding, what is the baseline against which we measure the failure of the institution to perform? And I want to suggest the baseline I'm going to describe is relative to the purpose of the institution. And that invites the question, how do we know the purpose? And it's that purpose that will be described internal to the institution. And by setting it up like this, what that means is it's possible that a certain institution will not have a clear or recognizable purpose. It's possible when we reflect on what the purpose is, the response will be, I don't know, not clear. But it's also possible, indeed, the whole enterprise depends upon believing that in certain contexts there is a purpose. Okay, let's start with an example. Think about the so-called mafia. I don't want to get in trouble around here. So, mafia. There is, I would suggest, a purpose to this institution, the mafia, to make money through crime. But imagine a reformer. I'm going to call him Bruce Corleone, inspired by Bruce, the vegetarian shark in Finding Nemo. Okay, so Bruce Corleone, who has the objective to steer the mafia away from crime, to evolve the institution of the mafia away from its focus on criminal activity to make money, to do something different. And whether that's through the fear of the FBI or because of the fear of God, it doesn't matter. The point is he wants to bend the institution away from what is understood to be its underlying purpose. Now, the way I'm describing the concept of institutional corruption, I want to say that would be a corruption of the mafia. And it's a good thing, too. I'm all for that corruption. So it's a good thing, even though it is this idea of corruption. Now, in setting up the idea of institutional corruption in this way, I've marked my conception in a controversial way. Others who have worked in this field have insisted that the idea of institutional corruption cannot be relative in this sense or positive in this sense, but needs to be normative. Marie Newhouse, who was a fellow at our center, has developed a very strong critique of this conception of institutional corruption as relative in this sense. But I mean the idea to inspire a certain sociology of institutions, and more particularly to invite a certain reflective practice within an institution, a reflective practice that asks people within that institution to first reflect on our purpose within this institution and whether our practices live up to the standards of that purpose. So in this sense, I am a relativist about institutional corruption, even though I believe that relativism has a purpose to facilitate a broader internal understanding of the institutions that we describe. Okay, so conceive of this relativist conception like this. This is a familiar device, the compass. Here's a familiar object, the magnet. We all have an intuition of what happens when we place a compass near a magnet. We produce what's described as magnetic deviation. The intuition this image suggests that there is a magnetic north that we expect the compass to be pointing to, which can be influenced in a way not primarily intended by those who designed the compass, is the description of the dynamic that I'm describing as institutional corruption. That is the influence. Within this economy of influence, all the other magnetic force fields that are in the space that weakens the effectiveness of that institution. This institution here is just the metaphor for the compass that weakens its effectiveness relative to its purpose to help us see magnetic north. Okay, then, how do we know its purpose? What's the process? And that's going to be a hard question, as I said, often. But the critical thing is to see sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's relatively clear. And that's the reason that I began this lecture focused on Blazer's book, The Missing Microbe. Because I want to suggest that Blazer is operating within a certain institution. Let's call that institution the institution of public health. Those who are reflecting on the way in which we should be intervening to achieve something like public health. And within that institution, there are people who work, people like doctors or researchers. Okay, now imagine that Blazer's claims were established. Imagine the argument is understood to be true, that antibiotics in the Chicago way are a huge unaccounted for externality. So that is assumed. But imagine then a researcher within that institution of public health responded to that truth in something like the following way. Well, what about the drug companies? They've invested billions in antibiotics. It's totally unfair for us now to say antibiotics are unsafe. Now, if you reflect on that exchange, that assertion, I suggest that most of us would feel a certain bizarreness to the argument of a member of that community, of that institution within the context of public health. Bizarre to reflect in that institution on these purposes that in some sense are external to that institution. Not that they're external to all policymaking. Of course, you need to worry about the way in which public health relates to important industries. But we recognize that for a normal researcher within that institution to so reflect would be to mark that researcher as troubled in a certain way, as kind of confused about what his or her job was. And to think then about the internal confidence that we would have that to understand that utterance as a mark of deviance is to understand the sense in which we know something about that institution of public health. That we know that institution is filled with what we think of as professionals who have a certain professional role or purpose, and that set of purposes constrains how people within the institution function. And we, as policymakers, can use that constraint to achieve public purposes. We can use their identity, this is who I am, in order to achieve public purposes. Now, not easily. There's an incredible complexity to this. And in later lectures, I want to describe some of the particular complexities around the idea of professionalism and the way professionalism, in some contexts, actually weakens people's ability to, quote, do the right thing. So I'm not asserting that there's a natural good to this idea of the professional, but what I'm saying is that in certain contexts, we understand people will operate constrained by their own conception of the appropriate role they have for that role in that institution. Okay, so here's where we are so far. I want to say institutional corruption is relative to the institution's purpose. Some institutions are going to have purposes, some won't. If it does have such a purpose, then it's possible to speak of it being corrupted. And if it does have that internal that purpose, then there's a possibility that there could be internal guidance that comes from the participants operating within that institution. Okay, now let's turn this to finance. Of course, the idea of finance is going to have many different meanings. I mean a particular sense in the context of this lecture. What I want to say is we think about finance as the economic infrastructure that will enable an economy, a modern economy, to function. So infrastructure, which evokes a public regarding sense, but also recognizes private entities filling out the core functions. So think of four entities: banks, investment houses, the Fed, and Treasury. Some of these are public, some of them are private. I want to focus on the private parts, the private elements of this infrastructure. And I want to focus further on the individuals within that private part. The individuals operate within banks or investment houses, the equivalent of the researchers or doctors in the missing microbes story. And the question I'm going to ask, so actually three questions. Number one, what can we say about the norms, the self-understanding, the conception of these private institutions? Number two, how might individuals within these institutions internalize those norms, those conceptions? And number three, how should we understand the limits of those private norms operating on the individuals within these institutions? Because these norms are not like chains. They don't bind us in some physically strong way. Indeed, we need to think of them more as gossamer threads that pull in a certain direction, but weakly. And it's the weakness, especially in a context of great temptation or incentive, that must guide us to think about other structures for restricting or assuring the public purposes served. Okay, now against the background of those questions, we can think a little bit about this history of finance within the recent history of America, at least. And that history, we forget because we're in the middle of something of a bad time. That history is actually a story of certain kind of optimism. I think in the context of bank failures, my colleague David Moss has this really dramatic graph describing the history of bank failures in the United States. So starting in the mid-19th century, these blue lines map the number of failures, bank failures. And the red lines map the percentage of GDP that was actually affected by those bank failures. And what's dramatic about this graph, of course, is this golden age. See, literally, golden age in the middle of almost no bank failures. And so what marks this golden age? Well, it happens to start the passage of a statute called the Glass-Steagall Act, a statute that separated banking functions from investment functions. Those two institutions couldn't live within the same house. And it ends at the point that we deregulate, reverse that policy decision by allowing banks and investment houses to become one again. And striking, but unrelated to the story I'm going to talk about here, is this overline graph, That's the percentage of income the top 10% share at these different periods of time. So in the period before that separation, the top 10% had a huge proportion, 45 to 50% of income. That drops dramatically during the period of the Golden Age, and then after the relaxation of this, it climbs right back up to where it was before. Okay, the Golden Age is a period of stability. Many believe this is a period of stability produced through a certain kind of regulation. But then the regulations were relaxed. And they were relaxed with the expectation, and we're now allowed to call it a bizarre expectation, that the markets would take care of themselves. Alan Greenspan testified, quote, "It's critically important to recognize that no market is ever truly unregulated. The self-interest of market participants generates private market regulation. Fear not. The market will take care of itself." Which inspired our own Richard Posner. I say our own because I worked for him. I say our own because he's a member of your community. To write, quote, "That was a whopper of a mistake for an economist to make. It was as if the head of the EPA, criticized for not enforcing federal anti-pollution laws, had said he thought the self-interest of the polluters implied that they are best capable of protecting their shareholders and their equity. They are indeed the best capable of doing that. But the reason for laws regulating pollution is that pollution is an external cost of production, which is to say a cost not borne by the polluting company or its shareholders. And in making business decisions, profit maximizers don't consider costs they don't bear." And so as applied to the financial services sector, Posner wrote, "Banks consider the potential costs of bankruptcy to themselves in deciding how much risk to take, but do not consider the potential costs to society as a whole." So this market didn't take care of themselves, or maybe it did take care of themselves, but didn't take care of us, because there were structural incentives established by this deregulation that led them away from that particular internalization of those externalities. And the consequences, of course, were bad, very bad. Federal Reserve of Dallas calculated the cost of the global financial crisis at $50 to $90 trillion. Not an insignificant event in our history. So bad, but here's the question: is it corruption? In the sense in which I've described corruption. An influence here within an economy of influence that weakens the effectiveness of the institution with effectiveness relative to the purpose. All right, well, so let's start with the purpose. And I want to talk about two particular parts of this private finance system. First, rating agencies. So everybody knows as entities like corporations issue bonds, those bonds get rated. And the rating agencies played, at least it's clear now, a pretty significant role in the downturn and collapse after 2008. The core rating agencies have an incredibly important role in our current regulation of the financial system. But as Roger Lowenstein describes, they've had historically an incredibly important role by virtue of the fact that their rating agencies were their impeccable objectivity. This was the virtue of rating agencies because of the way they were originally structured. Rated corporations had a big stake, Lowenstein describes, in the outcome of the rating, but little ability to affect it. And that was because of the way rating agencies were established. Moody's, a rating agency, was working for its subscribers, not for the issuers of the bonds. So what that meant is someone would subscribe to Moody's, pay them an annual fee to get ratings from bonds. Moody's would take that money and then invest it in the project of rating the bonds. So the people paying for the rating were not the people who wanted their bonds rated. Okay. But in the 1970s, the SEC was eager to find a way to make sure that brokers were holding assets that were actually worth something. So they wanted to penalize brokers for holding bonds that were not sufficiently trustworthy. So the agency decided, as Lowenstein describes, to create a new category of officially designated rating agencies and grandfathered the big three, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. And what that did, in effect, was to outsource the government regulatory function of deciding which of these bonds were of sufficient quality to be the sort of bonds that brokers should be allowed to be holding. It outsourced it in the sense that it said these private entities, these rating agencies, will make the judgment for us. So if the rating agents say that's AAA, that's okay. But if the rating agencies say it's not AAA, then that's not going to be okay, at least for certain kinds of brokerage holdings. Okay, but notice what that did. Now the rating agencies recognize they have an incredible power. Because rather than selling opinions, as Lowenstein put it, to investors, they're selling licenses that enabled very self-interested borrowers to operate in credit markets. And once they recognized this, they changed the way they sold their ratings. No longer did they sell their ratings to subscribers. Instead, they were paid by the very entities they were rating. So as the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission put it, we conclude the failure of credit rating agencies were essential cogs in the wheel of financial destruction. There's a novelist wannabe in this authorship here, okay? Because issuers could choose which rating agencies to do business with, and because the agencies depended on the issuers for their revenues, rating agencies felt pressured to give favorable ratings so they might remain competitive. Or as Simon Johnson and James Quack put it, Wall Street said, hey, if you don't give me the rating I want, the guy across the street will, and we'll give them all the business, and they just played one rating agency off against the other. Or again, Lowenstein, I think, has the most compelling description. Imagine the big rating agencies as three competitive saloons standing side by side, with each free to set its own drinking age. Before long, 9-year-olds would be drowning bourbon. So it's that pressure that changed the character of the rating the agencies actually gave, leading them to be giving AAA ratings for stuff we now see was junk. Okay, but is it corruption? And I want to say in this context, it's easy to see this as corruption. Because these agencies had, by virtue of their quasi-regulatory role, a purpose. Their purpose was to provide, quote, impeccable objectivity on the risk associated with these assets. And that was internal to their own self-understanding too, because the people operating within those agencies were researcher-like. They were like public health officials, but they were, instead of rating the risk of antibiotics, they were rating the risk of financial instruments. But that purpose was bent by a certain influence. You can think of this as the private short-term gain that increasingly became obvious as these agencies shifted their business model and became incredibly lucrative partners with the targets of their ratings. A term developed on the street, IBG-YBG, which stands for, hey, I'll be gone and you'll be gone before anybody figures out there's a problem here. And indeed, there are email exchanges that use this term precisely. Look, we'll retire with our millions and we'll be long out of Wall Street before any of this blows up, so fear not. And that dynamic and that short-termism bent, we could say, corrupted the institution that rating agencies were to be. This was an influence within an economy of influence that weakened the effectiveness of the institution, and as we all now recognize, weakened the public trust of the institution of rating agencies. Because this was an institution with this public purpose, and it failed to internalize the risks to that purpose in the way it established its business model. So rating agencies is one category. Think now about a second, more prominent. Banks. Okay, by banks I mean what we think of as banks today, because what we think of as banks today are very different from what they were historically. Historically, as I described, banks were separated. There were banks that provided services in the context of security, and there were investment houses, and the black line separating them was what we called the Glass-Steagall separation. This was a structural separation that fits the differences in incentives that would exist within these two different institutions. The objective of the bank was to provide security for the economy. It was to be a platform through which economic activity could occur, a reliable platform people could depend upon for the purpose of facilitating a real economy. Finance wasn't the objective, finance was the means to producing the real objective, which was to produce widgets or cars or other parts of the real economy. And then investment houses, this was a set of incentives around taking risks for very high rewards. And the difference, of course, between these two structural banks was that one was protected by the public and the other was not. The government backed up the security branch of the bank by guaranteeing deposits and regulating to make sure the security was delivered, and it didn't engage in that kind of protection or intervention in the context of the investment houses. But of course, what happened through the 1990s, culminating with the repeal of the Glass-Steagall, is that these two functions were folded into one. And what developed, obviously, was a structural conflict produced by the competitive pressure, similar to the competitive pressure among these rating agencies, that were exacerbated by a very interesting change in the ownership structure of many of these banks. As they merged together, they all became public companies, publicly traded companies, and they increasingly yielded to a certain short-termism in the way in which they engaged in the activity of taking risks to produce internal rewards. So take, for example, the most famous of these risks, the mortgage-backed securities. This incredible market of securitized risk facilitated by these new enterprises, which allowed banks to take up and pool the risks from many different mortgages, increasingly risky mortgages, under the theory that because they were pooled, it would reduce or eliminate the individual risk. A bizarre theory, but it captured the imagination of Wall Street because it paid so well to imagine exactly that. Now, what's interesting in the history of the development of the mortgage-backed securities is that one of the key houses on Wall Street, J.P. Morgan, which had initially developed securitization in other contexts, geniuses in that house had developed the idea of securitization in other contexts where it made sense. When they ran the numbers for mortgage-backed securities, they concluded it didn't make sense for them to engage in the mortgage-backed securities market. There were too many unknowns. We didn't actually have data for housing prices going back far enough. They didn't have data sufficient to establish that the risks were actually independent, so they thought it didn't make sense to assume this risks, and the initial decision of J.P. Morgan was not to assume the risk. But then J.P. Morgan saw its stock suffer relative to other institutions like Citibank, who just swallowed the risk as quickly as it could. And as the stock suffered, the executives inside of J.P. Morgan screamed louder and louder, "Why aren't we in this business?" And eventually, of course, they decided that mortgage-backed securities did make sense. And they got into the mortgage-backed securities market just like everybody else did, riding the wave until, of course, it crashed. Now, that dynamic is, of course, central to the way competitive businesses function. And this is what led Posner, again, to assert what doesn't sound like a classic deregulation position. Posner said, quote, am I saying that deregulation made bankers, and through them borrowers, take risks that were excessive from an overall social standpoint? The answer is yes, that's what I'm saying. Quote, once we recognize that competition will force banks to take risks in order to increase return that the economic and regulatory environment permits them to take, provided the risks are legal and profit maximizing, whatever their consequence for the economy as a whole. So what he's saying is, because they were deregulated, it created an environment where competition would force these banks to take on these risks, because taking on these risks made sense for the banks, even if it didn't make sense for the economy as a whole. That, of course, was bad. But was it corruption? And here, just to be a little bit dramatic, I'm going to surprise you. I don't think it was corruption. No, it's not institutional corruption. And the reason for that relates again to the structure. What is the purpose of these institutions? The purpose of these institutions, so described in this economic context, is to make money, and competition is driving them to do that very well, driving them to their purpose, to make money. Now, in this context, what they did was bad socially, but bad socially, as Posner puts it, because of the risks the regulatory environment permitted them to take. So I want to say it is not corruption, it is bad policy. It is bad policy that leads them to a place where they engaging in their self-understood purpose would produce the horrible external harms that they did. Now we can compare this. There's, again, in the field of people working on institutional corruption, dissent from this particular position. Malcolm Salter, who's a professor emeritus from the Harvard Business School, has developed a conception of institutional corruption in the context of financial industries, which focuses on what he calls short-termism as a kind of institutional corruption. So in his conception, you think about the banks as having a purpose, their long-term financial success, but they allow incentives to develop within the banks that drive agents in the bank to pursue short-term gains. And again, when you're talking about people who can make millions and millions of dollars, they are thinking about, how do I do it in 5 years and then get out so I can move to the Bahamas? So that structure of incentive permits them to behave in a way which is against the purpose of the institution of the bank. And so Malcolm says this is a kind of institutional corruption, short-termism. And I want to say that's a possible conception of institutional corruption here. But I'm going to resist it for a minute. To again maintain the counterintuitive character of the definition I want to push forward, because now what this is suggesting is the weirdness again in the conception of institutional corruption I've advanced. The weakening of the mafia, I say, is not corruption. I'm sorry, that should say not corruption. Yeah, I'm sorry, the weakening of the mafia is corruption, right? But banks' contribution to the financial collapse is not corruption, according to the conception of institutional corruption I'm offering. And that's to insist that we not confuse the idea of corruption with the idea of something just being bad policy. I want to carve a conception of corruption that is a distinct kind of wrong, which in certain contexts we say is actually going to do some good. Okay, but what about this part of what the banks are supposed to be doing, the security part? Couldn't we say that the failure to provide security was a kind of institutional corruption relative to the purpose of the banks? But I want to argue that the security, this public good of the original structure of the banks, was a byproduct of a regulatory structure. And not the aim or not the purpose of the private institutions that engaged in this activity, even though the consequences of them engaging in this activity are classic institutional corruption consequences, because of course the consequence of what happened to our financial sector has been to weaken public trust of that sector. And the consequence of weakening public trust is real and bad. This research by Luigi Guizzo and a local here, Luigi Zingales, finding that, quote, in the absence of any cost of participation, low level of trust can explain why a large fraction of individuals do not invest in the stock market, even though that would be the optimal behavior for them to engage in. That's to say the cost of this failure to trust is significant and bad, but I want to argue we don't necessarily need to conceive of it here as a kind of corruption. Okay, so I've argued there's not significant institutional corruption in finance. There are corners, like the rating agencies, but the core activity we shouldn't conceive of as institutional corruption within finance. But I do want to insist there's institutional corruption of finance. I want to say that we do not need to explain maximizing behavior within constraints. What needs to be explained here is the mindlessness of the constraints, the regulatory ridiculousness, the long list of lunacy that describes the actual public policy interventions in the context of finance. And there are many. I'm just going to point to a couple here. Think about the difference between the Dodd-Frank bill and the Glass-Steagall Act. The Dodd-Frank bill, which is 848 pages long, with endless regulations, most of them still under negotiation, versus Glass-Steagall Act, whose relevant passage was exactly a paragraph long, a couple sentences. Or think about the absence of transparency regulations around derivatives. Regulations which in the context of markets, one would think were obvious because for markets to function perfectly, we need information about the entity we are trading. But the obscurity around derivatives, of course, facilitated certain insiders in that market having an advantage over everyone else. And that obscurity, of course, led to the instability of the market, as no one had any clear sense of the exposure that these derivatives created, especially at the end of the 2007-2008 cycle. Or think about the response to the mortgage crisis. Of course, we had extensive bailouts of banks by the Fed and also by the government, but basically ignored the idea of bailing out mortgage holders, people actually who were living in houses that were underwater, significant portions of our population. Now, of course, that trade-off was initially the trigger for an incredibly important political movement. This was the event.
Capital are standing by at the CME group in Chicago. And Rick, have you been listening to this conversation?
Listening to it, I've been just glued to it because Mr. Ross has nailed it. You know, the government is promoting bad behavior because we certainly don't want to put stimulus for it and give people a whopping $8 or $10 in their check and think that they ought to save it. And in terms of modifications, I'll tell you what, I have an idea. You know, the new administration's big on computers and technology. How about this, President and new administration? Why don't you put up a website to have people vote on the internet as a referendum to see if we really want to subsidize the losers' mortgages, or would we like to at least buy cars and buy houses in foreclosure and give them to people that might have a chance to actually prosper down the road and reward people that could carry the water instead of drink the water?
Hey, Rick, that's the whole idea. Hey, Rick, did you?
This is the birth of the Tea Party, right here.
No, they're not, Joe. They're not like putty in our hands. This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all? President Obama, are you listening?
How about we all stop paying our mortgage? It's a moral hazard. Like mob roll here. I'm getting scared. I'm glad I'm
Don't get scared, Joe. They're already scaring you. You know, Cuba used to have mansions and a relatively decent economy. They moved from the individual to the collective. Now they're driving 54 Chevys. Maybe the last great car to come out of Detroit.
They're driving them on water, too, so it looks nice to watch. Hey, Rick, how about the notion that Wilbur pointed out you can go down to 2% on the mortgage.
You can go down to minus 2%
and still have 40% and still have 40% not be able to do it. So why are they in the house? Why are we trying to keep them in the house?
Mr. Summers is a great economist, but boy, I'd love the answer to that one.
Okay, so of course, at this moment, he announces the Tea Party, and the Tea Party gets born, and there's a rally around this idea that it's outrageous to imagine the government intervening to help people who are actually in mortgages that are underwater. And instead, of course, he doesn't rally the government against the idea that we should be helping the banks. And of course, the history is we help the banks and we do almost nothing for the people holding the mortgages. But I was very happy yesterday to be given this book, which I couldn't put down last night, by Atif Amian and Amir Sufi, which is an empirical analysis of the policies which we have engaged in with respect to the housing debt problem. And as they argue quite powerfully, to ignore the mortgage holders here was exactly backwards proper policy. That the much more effective intervention here, effective for everybody, would have been to help the mortgage holders. And as they account, for example, Peter Orszag, who was at the center of this policy decision, recounts it now as the major policy error of the administration. Christina Romer, more efforts were needed than were done, as the National Journal put it. Although the federal government would spend reams of cash to staunch losses suffered, by the financial sector, the auto industry, and state and local governments, suffering homeowners would see no relief. Now, why was that? Why was that? Or maybe most dramatically is the story that was engendered by Jed Rakoff's essay in the New York Review of Books. He was a federal judge writing a piece saying, hey, where are all my corruption and fraud cases from this recent meltdown? There are none in my courts. He says, we have a historical pattern in the United States. When we have a financial crisis like this, we basically lock them up. The people who have committed the wrongs which have led to the catastrophe bear responsibility for it. In the savings and loan crisis, 800 executives were convicted and sent to jail because of their misdeeds that led to that economic collapse. But this time, zero, not one, of the executives engaging in this. There's been lower level prosecutions for computer hackers, of course, but none of significant consequence for anybody who was in a decision position with respect to this. And Rakoff says, why? And he goes through lots of reasons that are typically given, like it's too difficult to prove, which he says is, from his own experience, just not sustained, or that you need reliance, but he says in a criminal case, there's no reliance necessary. And then he quotes the incredible suggestion by the Attorney General, accounting for the failure to do any prosecutions. The Attorney General said, quote, it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the economy. Now, Rakoff's response to that is basically this. He says, if we are talking about prosecuting individuals, then the excuse becomes entirely irrelevant because, of course, prosecuting individuals will not bring down the economy. You don't have to bring down Citibank or bring down JP Morgan in order to prosecute individuals responsible for the wrong. So Rakoff says, what's really going on here? And he has an account that points to the way in which we've allowed prosecutions in white-collar contexts to shift to corporations rather than individuals. He thinks that's a mistake. And the second part of his account is the fact that the government itself feels guilty because it encouraged exactly the policies that it would now be prosecuting. But I want to suggest that when you think about all these examples, there's a very different elephant in the room here. And Cambridge has a nice definition of this colloquial saying. You say there's an elephant in the room, you mean there's an obvious problem or difficult situation that people do not want to talk about. So what is the elephant in the room that might explain our response, our failure to respond in a sensible way in the context of this? I would say it's suggested by three numbers, 51%, 47%, and 32%. And an acronym, FIRE. Okay, FIRE stands for Finance, Insurance, and Real Estate. That's a group that we assemble when we talk about contributions to political campaigns. FIRE is the #1 contributor to congressional campaigns. And 51 and 47 and 42% is the percentage of money given to Democrats in 2008, 2010, and 2012 by FIRE. Okay, just look at those numbers for a second. And now think like Rahm Emanuel would. This is a disaster for the Democrats. And that trend is certainly going to continue in this cycle, even more. And as that trend continues, in the back of everyone's head, there's a recognition. We can't slay this dragon. So it's not that it's too big to fail or too big to regulate, it's that they are too dependent even to question the target of such regulation. Of course, Wall Street doesn't get everything, but the point is we must begin to accept that they get more than makes sense from any neutral, independent policy position because they have the power to veto here the most sensible changes. Veto in the sense that I spoke of last week with Francis Fukuyama's America, the Vetocracy. Veto is the product of what I described last week as the tweedism in America. This is what tweedism does for finance in America. This is the consequence of a structure of regulation that hasn't the capacity to regulate the proper targets of regulation because those who do the regulating realize that there's just so far they can go and continue to maintain the power that they believe they need. Okay, so there is institutional corruption within finance in the corners. There's institutional corruption of finance in gross. This is just one example, of course, of the government held hostage, I want to say, by the funders of our political campaign process. Held hostage not expressly, not by agreement, but by an understanding that every sane participant within that system has. It's the understanding of the limits of what's possible within an institutionally corrupted system. Is this the worst example of this? Of course, it leads to an incredible financialization of our economy, which economists are now beginning to recognize is actually destructive of our economy. This IMF working paper pulling together research to demonstrate that economies that get too much finance actually begin to be destructive of economic growth. But of course, there are many other issues. You pick yours: healthcare, gun policy, taxes, debt. All of them are instances of exactly this same dynamic. You can pick the one you think of as your worst. We can all agree that all of them are bad. But what I want this lecture to conclude with is we also see they are products of the most important type of corruption in this story, the first corruption in this story that facilitates or blocks the opportunity for addressing each of the others inside of the institutions, including the institution of finance. Thank you very much.
Perception.
Yeah.
The people's perception of almost all the institutes of government and corporations, and it's way down. Just what you're saying.
Right. The striking fact about almost all institutions here in this context is the loss of trust in these institutions. And part of the struggle is to figure out if we can tease out what the actual influence is that's leading to this loss of trust. And the particular one that has become salient for me is to recognize the way in which, building on the works of people like Hibbings and Thiel, that people's perception of corruption in the process is actually more important to them than their disagreement with the outcome. So, everybody says people don't care about process questions in politics. They only care about the substance question. Nobody told that to the Hong Kong protesters who were protesting about a purely process question about something that would happen 4 years hence. But in our context, too, I think we don't have a sufficient appreciation of the way in which we feel the system is not responsive to us because we believe the system has been corrupted in the sense that I'm describing. And that gets reinforced again and again when you have these great institutions that fail in this way, and then people reflect on what is the response that these failures evoke. When the economists conclude that, in fact, the sensible economic response to the collapse of the mortgage crisis was the inverse of what, in fact, we did, that only can feed the sense in which this is not a system responsive to what makes sense or what democracy would say. Over here.
Hi, thank you very much for speaking this evening. In terms of remedy, to use your word, which I know is at a later lecture, nevertheless, would you recommend a reinstitution of Glass-Steagall? Do you think that's possible? And could you comment on the Piketty model of remedy, which would be higher tax rates?
So let me take the second one first. I think I've come to the point where I believe that there's a whole slew of substantive reforms we have to take, but none of them are feasible within the current economy of influence of politics. So I'd like to get to the place where we can make the judgment without the corrupting influence in the background. Because if you had to make that judgment now, if we had to pass a tax policy now, it would be burdened by all of the deals that have to be made to reflect the interest. So I'm sure I would end close to where he is. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure, I guess. But again, I think we need to worry about the procedural problem before we can get to that substantive answer. Would I support the Glass-Steagall? I don't think of myself as sufficiently schooled to answer that question. I will say that's what Posner says. There are others who are not crazy leftists who believe that this is the simplest way to step in and to reestablish some kind of structure. And of course, there's great pushback against this idea. But what's most striking to me is that the idea itself can't be openly debated as an idea. It's taken for granted it will be a smaller type of reform. That's if you read the wonderful book, An Act of Congress, which is the account of the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act. You know, the Dodd-Frank Act is ratified by people who think they're trying to do the right thing. There's not like deep corruption in how it's done, but the opportunity set for possible reforms is radically narrowed because of the sense of, you know, what is feasible in the context of the political reality of that reform. So I would at least like to be in a place where we can openly have this as the debate, a consideration of it, which was not a place we're in right now. Way in the back.
Have you been able to take into account in your studies the effect of us as people taking out mortgages or voting, as you mentioned last week, in being ill-educated in our decisions and relying on others?
Well, of course, the account of the mortgage crisis, and in particular the account of the book that I was just referencing, points to a very significant role from just misunderstanding and a little bit of willfulness by people engaging in mortgage practices. You know, when people were experiencing the explosion in their, quote, wealth, because the housing values were going up, there is a rational reason to be taking advantage of that for a small set of those people. So if you think that your income is going to go up significantly, you have a borrowing constraint that makes it hard for you to actually borrow against your permanent life income, that gain is actually something that would make perfect sense to trade on. But most of the people that actually took advantage of that explosion in housing value were not people who expected higher income, or in fact were people whose income went down. So they were the wrong people to be taking these loans out. But on the other hand, you know, in a context where an incredible marketing machine is flooding the market with these offers for people to take advantage of the great wealth that they've now been given because their housing values have gone up significantly, it's hard to, I think, fault in the kind of ultimate moral sense that Santelli was faulting the people who took advantage of these offers. I mean, these were offers made by serious people on the other side. These were banks or financial people with actual experience and knowledge making offers, and they were accepted. These were not poor people wrestling money out of the bank's hands with force, right? This was a voluntary transaction. And in the context of what they were doing, the consumers, it's just wrong to describe it as a moral hazard problem. Because a moral hazard problem is typically where someone is in a position to take advantage of somebody else's mistaken calculation. So for example, you get a very cheap insurance policy for your car and you drive very recklessly because that's now pays because somebody's going to cover all of your costs. That's a moral hazard problem. But the individuals, the consumers in this context, could not have been engaging in a moral hazard because they couldn't have controlled any of the elements to the problem that would actually produce them having a windfall. The people who were engaging in moral hazard, of course, were the mortgage brokers in the middle who knew that they could issue these mortgages, get their fees, and move on. And so between the two, and certainly the institutions pushing in the context of the securitization of these mortgages, were also in a position to take advantage of that. So if it were a pure moral question, I'm still not convinced that the calculus would come out the way it did. But I think we should abstract the moral question and just ask the economic question: what would the right intervention be? And the right intervention, seems convincing, would not have been the intervention we actually did. Melvin.
Yes, you mentioned that back in the 80s and 90s, that 800 people went to jail for saving the loan crisis. Here, 20 years later, there was no cry to have the people who messed around with the CDOs in Europe and what have you go to jail. I saw very little of it in any of the newspapers or magazines. What happened in society that wasn't a call for justice or call for some sort of that the people who, the victims were, or the people who were in charge of this didn't go to jail. There was not much talk about it. What happened in this society at that time?
Yeah, it's a great point. There isn't this general outrage that led to pressure on the administration. But I think in this context, this is where administrations need to lead. The question for the Justice Department was, why wouldn't it have made sense? This is Rakoff's whole question, to proceed in exactly the same way we had before, because the clearest way to create the right incentives inside of a system like that is to hold individuals individually responsible. The idea of holding Citibank responsible is ridiculous because the executives have all their rewards and they can take their rewards and go with them. So that's the, again, in my perception, the elephant in the room. Why wouldn't that have been the obvious move to make? But then, I think, in the context of a fiercely competitive congressional fight over 1,000 other issues, there's a very practical question, not calculated in a crude sense of like, okay, we're going to give them this pass so that we get their campaign contributions, but more, who are the enemies we can create right now? And it's still the case that these are the most important allies to have in here. So how can you, on the one hand, be wooing these people in fundraisers, and on the other hand, have a Justice Department that's out there prosecuting them in federal court, right? And especially for the president, the striking thing about the president, we kind of forget this. Every president between Nixon and Obama had been elected through public funding. And that had a very important effect on their capacity to govern. When Ronald Reagan ran for re-election, the man who benefited from public funding more than anybody, he ran 3 national campaigns on the public's dime. When he ran for re-election in 1984, he attended 8 fundraisers. When Barack Obama ran for re-election, he attended 228 fundraisers. Now, you just think, first of all, how are you president of the United States and attending 228 fundraisers? Just physically, how is that possible? But the other point is, how many of those fundraisers are fundraisers in the context of the very people that you would have to be targeting if, in fact, you were going to go forward and do something about it? And the answer is a significant portion.
That's the corruption.
That's the corruption part, right? And we need to at least call it that. Yeah. Standing in the back.
You're talking about institutional corruption, but I want to ask you, what type of corruption do you consider this? When Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, and Alan Greenspan muzzled Brooksley Born, who was trying to put a stop on CDO leading up to the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. And secondly, what type of corruption do you see when really what we're talking about here is a pricing mechanism or equilibrium that's being messed with, either with cheap foreign labor dumping or with manipulation of tranches, with bad mortgages? What type of corruption is that messing with the pricing mechanism?
So I can't answer the second part because I don't think I know enough to say about the level of intent that would have been involved in that kind of manipulation. With respect to the Summers and Rubin muzzling of Brooksley Born, it's really an incredible story because at the point at which these derivatives are taking off, Brooksley Born's head of the Commodities Future Trading Commission, and the CFTC had traditionally had jurisdiction over futures, and derivatives were kind of a future. So Brooksley Born said, well, shouldn't somebody be regulating this, at least from the standpoint of transparency, so we know what's out there, so that when people are talking about the exposure of the economy to these financial instruments, we know how much exposure there is. Typically markets like stock markets, you know the price, you know what things are sold at, you know the quantity sold. That's what facilitates an efficient market. Why not at least information in this context? And there was a very strong pushback, and there's a very dramatic scene told in many of these accounts of them, very forcefully. Larry Summers calls her up and says, I have 13 bankers in my office, and they say that if you go forward with the even proposal of a discussion of whether there should be transparency in this market, it will bring about the greatest financial catastrophe we have seen in a generation. And so she went forward anyway. And that, of course, infuriated them even more. And the description of the exchange is really incredible. With the disrespect shown to her, that she didn't know anything about the law. She had been an editor of the Stanford Law Review when she was at Stanford in 1963. So, it was really an incredible exchange. But she, went forward very strongly, and then the government, leaders in the government, remember, this is the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration rallies Congress to pass, and eventually Congress passes the law. I think maybe this might be Bush who actually signs the law, but they're pushing it, to ban the CFTC from having anything to do with regulating derivatives. Okay, now, does that mean Larry and Bob Rubin were corrupt in the sense that I think? I think what's so interesting about this story is that there is such an overwhelming ideology driving them at the same time that for some people, but not necessarily these people in particular, there's a very strong economic interest too. But the ideology that Greenspan was operating on and Summers and they believed it was true that leaving the markets to self-regulate was the sensible strategy here. And they thought it was true in part because of the clumsy way in which markets get regulated and the clumsy way in which the SEC or the CFTC does their job. Better just to let everything. So when I think about these particular individuals, it's hard for me to say that these are criminals. I don't think they're criminals. I don't think they're people who sort of self-consciously thought, this is the way I'm going to get rich. And that's why the whole focus of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about institutional corruption is trying to say, we've got to stop trying to litigate at the level of the individual and start thinking about the way in which the structure of incentives is producing just as bad outcomes as would have been produced by people sitting down and figuring out how they can hack the system and bribe somebody to get some particular kind of advantage. So, I know Larry Summers. I don't know Bob Rubin. I know Larry Summers. I know him to be a brilliant person. I know him to be very strongly criticized by some of my closest friends. It's hard for me to think of him as a criminal. And that's what you'd have to think that he was doing this in the way that you were suggesting that might be the kind of corruption that was there. But my point is, we don't have to go there in order to understand the structure of this as a kind of corruption that is just as important to be remedied. Yes, sir, right here. Sorry, then we'll come back over here.
Last week you talked about Congress as an example of an institution that's corrupt within, and this week you talked about finance as an example of an institution that's corrupted by. Is there an example of an institution in society right now that is powerful, but you do not feel is either corrupted within or corrupted by?
Maybe. So next week is going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to tell a story that links Fox News and Edward Snowden. Okay? And in the context of understanding the way the media, what the institution of the media is, I think it's a hard problem in exactly the way you're thinking about it. And I'm still figuring it out, I think. But I'm not going to ruin the punchline for next week. Over here.
I think one of the points that you make in the talk is that a lot of people in finance don't really internalize the long-term effects of their actions. What do you propose as sort of way to remedy that? Because one of the things intuitively I was thinking of, high turnover would be a big problem for like the banks themselves if employees just have a short-term horizon as well. So
yeah, there's a whole slew of proposals that have been made to make it so the agents within these firms are internalizing the long-term consequence of their behavior. So the simplest thing to think about is like clawbacks of profits that they've made, or not allowing them to recognize the profit until later in the cycle of the deal that they've engaged in. And this is the sort of thing that leads Mal Salter to say that we should think of short-termism as its own kind of corruption. And again, then it forces the question, which I was asking before, of well, how do you deal with the interplay between the drive the market seemed to push towards short-termism and the very nature of the competitive market here? Isn't this a product of a failure of a certain kind of intervention? And I still think that's an open question. So I think there are clearly ways in which they are and they can facilitate this kind of constraint. But one of the problems the firms face is to the extent one firm constrains, another firm doesn't, and to the extent the other firm doesn't, they attract a different kind of talent from the one that does. Now, one suggestion's been made that's interesting. I don't think I know enough to say whether it's how strong it is that the very institutional structure of these firms is conducive here. So when these firms were partnerships, genuine partnerships, so that all the partners were individually liable for the losses of the firm, there was a much greater concern about the long-term consequence. But when you turn it into a publicly traded company, where on the screens of everybody's computer is a constant ticker that says what's happening to the stock price. This is another dynamic that happened in the Enron case, where that was the thing they're constantly focusing on, the stock price. And that's because their own personal wealth and the view of the company as succeeding or not in the media's characterization of the company is totally a function of stock price. That structure itself drives them in a way that makes it impossible for them to actually stand up for what would make sense for the company going forward. That's the story of JP Morgan and mortgage-backed securities. And that's why many people are thinking about how to bring these firms private once again, so they're not subject to this kind of pressure. This is like stock market as its own kind of corrupting influence on the long-term capacity of the firm to function. You seem to have a thing to add to this point.
So we look back at history, 1994 Peabody, 1995 Orange County, California, then long-term capital management. And if you read Lawrence McDonald's book, The Colossal Failure of Common Sense, the risk management people, Lehman, brought the issues to management and they didn't care. So there's two trends there. Each one of these events has been bigger than the last one. So if we were learning, it would go in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And then the second one is, you just talked about the structural issue of these firms, the risk department, reporting to the people who make the bigger bonus depending on what they do here. So I think the basic question is, we haven't really addressed anything from 2008 from a serious structural perspective. What are your thoughts on some ideas of what might be a constructive debate to start in our society?
Well, I agree with you that we haven't addressed these fundamental structural issues. And again, I've suggested that one of the reasons we haven't addressed them is that we don't have a government that's actually powerful enough to address them, or more precisely, independent enough to address them. And that reality means it's not clear exactly what we can do to bring about that conversation, except facilitate people like you raising the question and pushing it more and more inside of the political system. And I think it's also about finding a way to unite or cut across the partisan divide on this issue. I think there's actually real potential for a conversation that links the kind of Tea Party half of American politics, or Tea Party fifth of American politics, with for the people on the left around this type of issue. And you've seen some of that develop in the context of the antitrust, the revival of antitrust as a theory here, like Luigi Zingales' book, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, has a conception of what he calls political antitrust. And the argument of political antitrust is the antitrust officials should not think just about the economic efficiency of the market, given the different, but they should think about the political power of these entities inside the market. And if the political power is too great, such that they will have the capacity to corrupt the political system, to protect themselves against future competitors, that's a reason enough to intervene to break them up in this sense. And that certainly applies in the context of finance directly. I mean, when you have the Attorney General who is so confused that he can't distinguish between prosecuting individuals and bringing down, a bank, it's clear that we just are at a place where this is just so much off the table, not even utterable, that the most basic mistakes are made in thinking about it. And I think there's a related point about equality here. There's a big debate about equality, which is of the form, does inequality create more incentives than equality? And that's a kind of boring debate that's been around forever. And I'm saying not important, but there's a twist on it that the kind of political antitrust raises in this context, which is when inequality is great enough, it makes it incredibly hard for what I was calling the gossamer threads of doing good to have effect anymore. And I was talking to a financial reporter who asked me, so why is it that Wall Street in the 1970s or 1980s didn't display the same kind of grotesque, violation of rules that they display today? And my response was, when cheating gets you $50,000, you probably won't cheat. I mean, some people will, but I'm saying a decent person probably won't. But when it's $5 million, who among us really believes that we have the strength, given the right kind of temptation, to continue to do the right thing? So in a context where that amount of wealth is on the table, possible to be divided by these relatively small number of entities, what do you expect mere humans to do? Which is another reason to think institutionally, structurally about the way in which to deal with that in order to avoid the context where humans can't behave ethically because they can't, they physically don't have the capacity to anymore in the face of that kind of risk. Right there, yes, sir.
I know you focused a lot on the banks as in the terms of institutional corruption, but could you speak to the revolving door between financiers and regulators, and also the idea that finance is becoming so complicated that the only people who can actually regulate them are former bankers themselves?
It's a great point, and even more exacerbated by the kind of wannabe structure that exists within some corners of, for example, the SEC and Wall Street. It's a very clear story in the context of the rating agencies, where the rating agencies people were all people who wanted to be working for the banks. So they were eager to develop the kind of relationships that would make it easy to transition into that. And this problem in general is, of course, quite pronounced inside of Washington. Jack Abramoff, infamous felon, former lobbyist, actually a friend, somebody I have deep respect for now for what he's done since he's left prison. Jack Abramoff's book has this amazing passage where he says, the most effective technique that I had as a lobbyist was that I would walk into a senator's office and I would talk to the chief of staff, and I would say to the chief of staff, so what are you doing in 2 years? The chief of staff would say, I don't know, Jack. And Jack would say, I want you to look me up. And he said, from that moment on, I owned that staffer, and not a single dollar had changed hands. And this idea of people thinking about their potential future is an incredibly important part of understanding exactly why it's hard to create independence inside of these agencies. Now, you don't want to overstate it. There's some expertise that it is good to have a cycle back and forth. There's some people who argue that inside the Defense Department, for example, this cycle is essential for certain areas. I mean, I would be skeptical about it in general, and so I want to be convinced of it. But the point is, if you create an environment where the business model of a personal career is tied to supporting the interest of these powerful entities, it's not surprising they're not going to resist it. So my friend Jim Cooper, who's a congressman from Tennessee who went to Capitol Hill first in 1983, said, you've got to understand, Capitol Hill has become a kind of farm league for K Street where the lobbyists work. And he says that what I mean is that that members of Congress and staffers and bureaucrats all have a common business model. Their life after government, their life as lobbyists. More than 50% of the Senate and more than 40% of the House leave to become lobbyists. So in all of these institutions, this is a dynamic that I think creates exactly the context in which it makes it impossible for them to do the right thing. So I've been told we have one last question, which is yours, so it has to be the best question. Here's the mic.
You ended last time talking about optimism versus pessimism, and in finance, I wanted to ask, what new players can clean up, or can new players clean up the financial dependence that breeds this institutionalized corruption? Your super PAC targets existing parties. What about creating new ones that are unobstructed by the tainted history of finance and politics?
Well, yes, I think there's incredible potential coming from the states, actually, to create pressure to change the way in which a lot of these structures are being regulated. You saw an incredible debate in New York when Zephyr Teachout ran for governor in the Democratic primary against Andrew Cuomo. She had $400,000. Andrew Cuomo had $30 million, but she got 37% of the vote against Andrew Cuomo. Completely unknown campaign, but won every county outside of New York. It was an incredible campaign, but all of her campaign, and Tim Wu was her colleague, her lieutenant governor, was about talking about new antitrust and corruption structures that the state could insert that would facilitate, not just in the context of finance, but also in the context of, for example, internet policy, a better balance than is being produced at the federal level. So yes, I think there's lots of work to be done, especially at the state level, building pressure to create some kind of reform. As for third parties, I think that we have a whole list of changes that have to be made to our government. But I think you got to work out the sequence of reform. So if we changed it so that we could have third parties compete as easily as the two primary parties, which would require a huge change. Peter Ackerman spent, I think it was a total of $40 million was spent in the last election cycle to try to get a third-party candidate on the ballot in 50 states before they finally gave up because the system fell apart. But the point is, it is almost impossible to effectively have a third party at the presidential level, and certainly at the congressional level, it's almost impossible. But if you just made it easy to have a third party but didn't change the way you funded elections, you've just increased the number of people who are appealing to the tiny fraction of the 1% who fund elections. So you haven't changed the incentives that are producing the distortion that I'm talking about. But if you change the way you fund elections, so you imagine small dollar public funding of elections, whether that's vouchers or matching funds, you create an incredible opportunity for these parties to actually have a new resource to make it possible for them to compete in an aggressive way. So if you're a Green Party person, you can go to people in your community and get them to give you their vouchers, then you have a chance to compete in the way that is very hard to compete right now. So I'm all for thinking about the way in which multiplying parties might or might not help. I'm not actually committed one way or the other. But I am committed to the idea that before we do that, we have to address the root corruption that makes it impossible for any of these reforms to have any significant change, and that's changing the way we fund elections, what we talked about last week. But I'm going to try not to talk about too much next week, I promise. So thank you very much.